Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 177 of the podcast. And in this episode of the podcast, I'm talking about Jon Gruden resigning as head coach of the Raiders after his email scandal. Jon Gruden has resigned as head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders after past emails he sent former Washington executive Bruce Allen have surfaced. And in those emails, Gruden made problematic, racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and hateful comments. There have been many scandals when it comes to coaches. I mean, just this month, you also have all the nonsense happening with Urban Meyer. But why this is way worse for the Raiders than it would be for most teams is because they made Gruden the face of the franchise. He was bigger than any player. He was bigger than Khalil Mack. He was bigger than Derek Carr. They gave him 10 years, over $100 million. Yes, it would look bad if the Jaguars end up firing Urban Meyer, but he is far from the biggest name in the organization. They still have Trevor Lawrence. The Raiders made it where Jon Gruden goes, so goes the Vegas Raiders. And what I'd like to say about the comments Gruden made in the emails is it does not matter when those comments were made or who Gruden was and wasn't working for. It is and never was okay to say those things about human beings. And I don't buy the argument that these are private emails. Privately, you still can be a monster of a human being. Also, Gruden's apology was pathetic, saying he doesn't want to keep talking about this and there isn't an ounce of racism in him. Nothing he could have said could have saved him his job, but what he did say, in my mind, made it worse. He's not sorry. He's just sorry he got caught, and in those emails, Gruden revealed his true character. Not the best transition in the world, but I also want to talk about the football aspect of this story. For the longest time, I felt that Jon Gruden has been super overrated. He won a Super Bowl with carryovers from Tony Dungy's roster. Gruden has a career record of 117 and 112, and in his second stint with the Raiders, he went 22-31 before the controversy. And since winning the Super Bowl with Tampa in 2002, he's won double-digit games once, and that was back in 2005, more than 16 years ago, and he hasn't coached a team to the playoffs since 2007. When I think of him, I think of a guy who is obsessed with changing quarterbacks. He went through so many in Tampa Bay: Brad Johnson, Jeff Garcia, Brian Griese, Chris Sims, and with the Raiders, it always felt like he was trying to move on from Derek Carr. I mean, he paid Marcus Mariota a boatload of money to be the backup. So with all that being said, why exactly did the Raiders become obsessed with someone they traded away to Tampa Bay almost 20 years ago? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one, Gruden won the Super Bowl, and he beat the Raiders in that process, becoming the youngest coach at the time, winning the Super Bowl at age 39. Mike Tomlin has since gone on to win the game at 36 years old. Gruden became the guy who got away. And the second reason, and I think this is the biggest reason why they brought him back, he became a celebrity, a larger-than-life figure as a broadcaster for Monday Night Football. And I've seen this happen over and over again when former players and coaches become beloved broadcasters. We tend to look back at their careers more fondly than they really were. Recent examples include Tony Romo. Tony Romo was a fantastic quarterback, but he is now way more beloved as a broadcaster than he ever was as a football player. Bill Cowher comes to mind. Bill Cowher was an excellent head coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but every time there's a job opening, we bring up the name Bill Cowher, and that's because we see his face on TV every Sunday morning. And in basketball, you have Jeff Van Gundy, who for the last 15 years has been arguably the best basketball announcer. And every time there is a head coach opening position in the NBA, somebody brings up the name Jeff Van Gundy. And because he is a celebrity, we see him on TV, and Jon Gruden has been living off of this myth. He has become a mythical, larger-than-life figure since he became the ESPN guy. And then when he got to the Raiders, he wasn't being paid because he's an excellent coach. He was being paid because he is a celebrity. On the broadcast, he was flamboyant. He was a lot of fun. I mean, he was fun in those broadcasts. I wouldn't say it was my cup of tea watching him, but I could see why people were becoming obsessed with him as a personality. I don't think this hiring was ever about Jon Gruden as a football coach. I think this was a thing to bring in a big name. We all knew who Jon Gruden was, way more than when we knew him as the head coach of the Raiders and as the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Again, this is a guy who hasn't won double-digit games since 2005. You can't tell me that this hire was ever about the football. It was never about the football. It was about the fact that Jon Gruden was a big name. I think being great on TV helps build up your reputation. Listen, Charles Barkley was one of the best players of the 1990s, but you can't tell me that his reputation is way better now as a broadcaster for TNT. We love Charles Barkley because he's fun on TV, but I wouldn't want Charles Barkley to run my organization. That's what happened with the Raiders. They went out and got Jon Gruden to run their organization. I'm not saying Jon Gruden is a bad football coach. He did win a Super Bowl, but that was back in 2002. There was no reason for the Raiders to be this obsessed about this guy and bringing him back. At the time of Gruden's return, we all acted like it was a massive deal, like it was Joe Gibbs going back to Washington. No, Joe Gibbs won 3 Super Bowls with Washington. Jon Gruden has never had that amount of great success with the Raiders. He won his Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and again, he mostly did it with Tony Dungy's roster and his defense. I feel like the Raiders and most of us were evaluating Gruden because of his TV personality and not based on his football background. His resume as a head coach is not that spectacular. There's an outlier. He won a Super Bowl at 39 years old. That's fantastic, but that doesn't warrant that massive contract that the Raiders gave him. He did that back in 2002. And now not only has Jon Gruden not returned the Raiders to their former glory, he's now failed them on a human level as well. He was a despicable human being. Just read any of those emails. So not only did you not bring in one of the greatest head coaches and you hired him like he was great, you brought in a horrible human being. I also think there's an aspect of the story that nobody is talking about, why the Raiders were so desperate to bring back Jon Gruden. And I think it's because they're a team that has for the longest time had a face to their organization, and that face was Al Davis. He was the Raiders. He was the one guy. You talked about Al Davis, you were talking about the Raiders, and the Raiders were without that guy, so they were desperate to bring in another guy, and they thought that that guy was going to be Jon Gruden, that he was going to be this larger than life figure, that he was going to make them super entertaining, and you were going to watch them because they had Jon Gruden, that all of his words were going to be magic, that you were going to talk about the days of the just win baby, and it was going to go back to being fun being a Raiders fan. None of that really happened. Listen, there are other teams that are like this. When you think of the Cowboys, you think of Jerry Jones. Jerry Jones is the face of the Cowboys. Yes, they've had Michael Irvin. Yes, they've had Troy Aikman. Yes, they've had Emmitt Smith. Yes, they've had Tony Romo. Yes, they've had Dak Prescott. The consistent figure for the Cowboys has been Jerry Jones. And for the longest time, the consistent figure for the Raiders was Al Davis. And I think they were trying to fill that hole with Jon Gruden. And let's not forget about this. The Raiders love controversy. Al Davis made controversial comments. He was always at it with the commissioner of football. He was always moving the team to Los Angeles. They love that kind of controversy. Now, Gruden brought his own type of controversy, but it was the wrong type of controversy. But don't tell me the Raiders did not love it when they were feuding with Antonio Brown. They were the talk of the town. Everyone was talking about the Raiders. Everyone was talking about Jon Gruden. Everyone was talking about Mike Mayock, and everybody was talking about the Raiders. And I think they were eating that up. Any publicity is good publicity for the Raiders, but now it's ended in the most shameful way. There is a large part of me that when I say the win-loss record of Jon Gruden in his second stint with the Raiders is 22-31, there's a part of me thinks that the Raiders don't care. Jon Gruden made them relevant. We were talking about them because of Gruden, and now we're talking about them for all the wrong reasons. I think they kind of got what what they deserved because they brought Gruden in to be edgy. They wanted to be the 70s Raiders. Look, we're not always on the right side of things. We're right on the edge between right and wrong, and it turned out to be they were terribly, terribly wrong. I think they did know he was a bad human being from the get-go. They just thought that most of the public would never find out. I also think one of the biggest lessons of this story is to not glorify football coaches. It's not about the football coach. It's about the players. Like from the beginning of his tenure with the Raiders, they chose John Gruden over Khalil Mack, and Khalil Mack has gone on to do great things with the Chicago Bears. Guess what? A head coach is not going to win you a Super Bowl, especially probably John Gruden at this time. He is overrated, like I said, but I would never pick a head coach over great franchise talent. I think they've done some of the same thing with Derek Carr. Derek Carr has never felt stable with his job because John Gruden is always threatening to replace him publicly. Again, back to my point, I think they made this all about the head coach and the face of their organization because that's their history. Their organization has had faces. It's had Al Davis. It's had John Madden. The players on your football team are more important than the figureheads who are running it. The Buffalo Bills are great right now because they have Josh Allen. The Kansas City Chiefs are great right now because they have Patrick Mahomes. They have great talent on their roster. They have Travis Kelce. The Raiders right now are without great talent. They have Derek Carr, who I think is a very decent quarterback, and they have not done enough around him to be a winning football team because they've made it all about their head coach. And now that their head coach is gone, where do they go from here? I also want to talk about the fact that all of their splashy moves have had nothing to do with their roster. Remember, they brought in John Gruden. It wasn't about the roster, it was about the head coach. They gave him 10 years, they gave him $100 million. That did nothing to improve their football team. And then there were those years where we were talking about them becoming the Vegas Raiders. That has nothing to do with their football team. They were trying to do splashy moves that didn't concern their roster. And the one time they did do a move for their roster was Antonio Brown, and then that whole thing blew up in their face. When was the last time the Raiders made a great football decision? It's all been about making splashy moves, naming Gruden as the coach, going back to the glory days of 2001, even though those weren't glory days, and going to Vegas. It's never about the actual football team. That's what I think is the biggest failing of the Vegas Raiders, is they never make it about their actual football team. I don't know many of the players on their roster because they don't make a big deal about them. They didn't even make a big deal about Derek Carr when he was competing for MVP. He's a good quarterback, and they were trying to replace him because they made it all about John Gruden. I think this has to go up there as one of the worst coaching hires in the history of football because it was never about the winning. Mark Davis brought in John Gruden to be the face of the Raiders. It was never about football. It never seemed like it was about football. It was about John Gruden getting the spotlight like Al Davis used to and being the face of this franchise. So everything was about Gruden and none of it was about the actual football being played on the field. And there were just enough moments to make you think, oh wow, maybe this Raiders team is going to be a postseason team. And then last year they finished 8-8. They seemed like they were going nowhere and they didn't seem that mad about it. They didn't seem to have a path forward. They weren't going to go out and spend a ton of money on free agency because guess what? They already had the biggest name they thought. It was John Gruden. Too much of what was going on with the Raiders was about Gruden, and now it's totally blown up in their face, and they might never recover from this. They really might never. So where should the Raiders go in their next head coach? I think it should be more about the football, and it should be more about getting the best out of Derek Carr, and there's one guy I'm talking about, Patriots offensive coordinator Josh McDaniels. He knows how to get good seasons out of quarterbacks. Yes, he was a failed head coach with the Broncos, but I think if you make a good football hire on Josh McDaniels, no, it won't be a splashy signing. We won't be talking about it for days, but I think it is a good football hire. He will make your offense more efficient. And I do think he's one of those guys that deserves a second chance being a head coach in the NFL. I mean, listen, the Broncos thing blew up in his face, but so many guys are given second chances. The Raiders gave John Gruden a second chance when he didn't deserve it. Just get a guy to be the head coach who isn't bigger than the team. And that's where I think they're probably headed. They're probably going to try to get one of those big name splashy hires. And I think if they do that, it's going to blow up in their face all over again. Don't get a guy who's bigger than the team. Actually make the team noteworthy and important in and of itself. And no one talks about the fact that, remember, the Buffalo Bills used to have Rex Ryan as their head coach. They brought him in because he was a big name. He went to 2 AFC championship games. We all knew who he was. That's why the Bills brought in Rex Ryan, because they wanted that guy to be the face of their organization. Then that didn't work out, and they brought in Sean McDermott. No one on earth knew who Sean McDermott is. But guess what? Now he's arguably the best head coach in the AFC East right now. Sorry, Bill Belichick. It's probably McDermott right now. That's the type of guy the Raiders need to go after. Stop going after the guy who has a history, who is a big name. It's not going to get you anywhere. You're going round and round in circles. Get a guy like Josh McDaniels, who needs his second stint to go way better than his first one. And we all know what happened with the Colts, but I think Josh McDaniels deserves a second chance with the Raiders. I think it's the perfect fit. He can get the best out of Derek Carr. At the end of the day, getting back to John Gruden, I don't think anything went right during his second stint as the Raiders coach. So let's look back at it. They make that hire. We made fun of the contract from the get-go. We all knew it was for the splash. It was all for us to talk about it. And listen, they wanted that right, because guess what we're talking about? We're talking about Gruden, and we're talking about the Raiders. So in that aspect, they won a little. We were talking about them, but now we're talking about them because, listen, we're disgusted with the Raiders as an organization because of what Gruden said, and they probably knew he was capable of saying such things. So now they're in that bad spot. Listen, and then he brings in Antonio Brown and that whole debacle. I wasn't a fan of that whole nonsense. And I think as much as the Raiders were obsessed with Gruden being the face of the organization, Gruden was equally obsessed. He was more obsessed with being the face of the Raiders than actually winning football games. He had the attitude of a guy who won a Super Bowl 2 years ago, not the attitude of a guy who hasn't won a Super Bowl since 2002. So not only did you not win more football games with John Gruden as your head coach than you did with Jack Del Rio, guess what? Derek Carr did not get any better under John Gruden, and now you are the laughing stock of the National Football League because of this email controversy. Gruden has left the Raiders in a far worse state than they were than when he entered, and the most maddening thing about the whole thing is it looks like the Raiders don't even care. Mark Davis won't talk about it, saying talk to the NFL, like he's mad that the NFL made him fire his head coach. He's not mad about the fact that John Gruden was a clown and a bad person. The Raiders need to show an ounce of self-awareness and admit that this was a huge failure on their part. They didn't care about him as a man or as a football coach. They cared about him as a figurehead, and that is their biggest failure during John Gruden's second tenure with the Las Vegas Raiders. It was never about winning football teams. It was about winning the headlines. And now the biggest headline of all is you're all clowns. This is also probably a great indicator about how maybe the past should stay in the past, and bringing back the guy who was the coach of the team in 2001 wasn't the best idea ever. It should be about the Raiders moving forward. Too much about the Raiders is about their past. It's about the glory days. It's about when we were winning Super Bowls and just winning. I get it, but they need to make it about the now, and none of their recent moves have been about the now. It's been about the past. Bringing John Gruden was about the past. The reason I thought John Gruden would never end up coaching the Raiders for the 10 years, I thought it was going to be about the football, and now it ended up being about something totally different. But when you give a guy that contract, you give him the power, you make him the face of the organization, and like it or not, you you are betting on him as a human being. So in the coming years, the Raiders are going to have to admit their part in this controversy. They want to make it all about the NFL. They want to make it all about Gruden. No, the Raiders have to look in the mirror and look at this as the ultimate failure of franchise history. And the last thing I'll say about this and John Gruden is, I hope the next face of the Las Vegas Raiders is actually a football player. It doesn't need to be a John Gruden type. It doesn't need to be an Al Davis type. Make it a player. That's where the league is headed. It's all about the players. We're no longer in the past where the figurehead is everything. We've glorified the days of Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry and Al Davis even, but those days are gone and the Raiders need to be aware of it. Make it about the players. Just get a decent football head coach who's going to make your team better. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So please rate, review, and subscribe.